There's been a ton of negativity around Consort Radahn and a small amount of positivity, but whichever way people view him, they end up taking a very extreme stance on his quality. One side thinks he's a spawn from hell, while the other side thinks he's amazing and can't really see his flaws. While I think Radahn's quality is something more in the middle. But to back up that claim, let's go over what Radahn does right and what he does wrong. And his first wrong is something that's actually not in the fight itself. Instead, it's that Radahn is the DLC's final boss in the first place. As we all know, Radahn is already a boss in the main game, one that a lot of people liked. And since we fight him after he's already been nuked by Millennia, a lot of people wanted to fight with him at his peak. So why is it that when a DLC delivers exactly that, it ends up being bad? And it's mainly because he's the final boss. I don't think people would have complained much if it was just some random Remembrance boss, since FromSoft final bosses are essentially meant to be the peak of the DLC, like Gale, Orphan or Fume Knight, and although Radahn is very different to fight than his base game version, because of his similar looks and his name being the same, it ends up feeling like they've essentially reused Radahn for the final boss, which is pretty disappointing, especially since a lot of people already had a final DLC boss in mind, being Godwyn, since his story is left somewhat unfinished. But moving on from that, let's get into the actual fight, where Radahn instantly jumps at us, following the trend set by the previous two DLC's final bosses, Gale and Orphan. But does this first phase actually live up to the quality of those previous bosses? And the answer is yes. Although he hits like a truck and his attacks are pretty hard to dodge, he doesn't have anything really unfair or unbalanced, and he gives an attack opportunity after most of his attacks. Although I have seen a lot of people complain about this cross-slash attack being undodgeable. With how little damage it does, it's not that big of an issue to me, but with the sheer amount of people saying it, I would assume it is an actual thing. So I'll count it as an issue. And the other issue is that his hitboxes are a bit too big for the actual attack. But Radahn's first phase is good enough that even with him having issues, I would still say he's like an 8 to 9 out of 10 boss. And there really isn't much you can complain about. Unless you want to complain about difficulty, but he is the game's final boss, so he should be pretty difficult. Same way that if you've been enjoying the video, you should subscribe and like for more like this. But all of that phase 1 good stuff changes when you reach 75% of his HP. And the big issues start popping up real quick. In phase 2. In phase 2, Miquella goes Twin Princes and hops on Radahn's back. And that itself is already a huge issue. See, Miquella's hair is huge, so it ends up taking away like 80% of the attack visibility, and makes you only really be able to see hair. And with him doing that, you can no longer actually see what attacks are coming towards you, forcing you to memorize the entirety of phase 1 so you don't just instantly die. Since if you can't tell what attack he's about to do by just the startup, all you can really do is panic roll and pray that you don't die. But moving past Miquella's fresh cut, the first attack of phase 2 shows an issue pretty well. Radahn ascends to heaven and calls down a nuclear strike, and while the attack itself isn't hard to dodge, it shows the second issue of performance really well. See, Radahn's second phase is so strong, not only does he fight you, he also fights your PC or console. And unless you got a good one, he absolutely demolishes it, thereby also destroying your frame rate. And now this is something that affects me more than most people since I'm playing on a really old PS4. The frame rate for this fight drops to like 15 or 20, and I've seen a lot of PC players also report performance issues in the DLC, ones that I would assume would be made worse by Radahn's visual effects. Turns out throwing out a bunch of light beams completely destroys your frame rate, and the next issue is also brought by these light beams. See, Radahn's first phase is already hard enough to dodge as is, and Miquella's hair has made it much harder by taking away a ton of visibility. And the light beams will also take a ton of visibility, while also punishing you for dodging badly, which will be familiar to you if you played Ring City. Gale does the exact same thing with his cape, where he adds extra attacks that hit you if you don't dodge well. But the difference is, Gale's cape doesn't do too much damage, and it also doesn't take away a bunch of visibility by flashbanging you every 2 seconds, which is why it works much better than Radahn's light beams. And at this point in Radahn fight, you can only really see the beginning of the attack, and after that it's just white, whether it be the hair or the constant light beams. But apparently this is still too much visibility for the game. So you know what, let's add even more visual clutter by making Radahn go light speed and summon after images. These after images confused me even more than the hair or the light beams. I still have zero clue to dodge the after images, so I just kind of ignore them and only dodge the final hit of it. And now here's the thing, while it seems like I've been talking about several different issues, in reality I've just talked about one big issue, which is visual clutter caused by spectacle. Elden Ring focuses on the spectacle the most out of any of the other Souls games, with bosses like Bale and Placidusax being the peak of visuals, and Radahn also tries to have a ton of spectacle. But having distracting visual and big spectacles doesn't really work when you make the actual fight really hard. Placidus Axe and Bale may have amazing visuals, but they're not exactly super difficult, since balancing spectacle and difficulty is kind of near impossible, since super cool visuals just kind of distract you from the actual fight and make it way too hard to dodge, which is probably why the most dominant strat for Radahn right now seems to be parrying, since it just skips most of the light beams and a lot of the hair. And now that we talked a ton about his issues, this is the part where I should probably defend him a bit. You see, Radahn has a ton of issues, but the difference between him and a boss like Bet of Chaos or Godskin Duo is that bosses like that, which are terrible, don't just have issues, they suck in their entirety. Radahn on the other hand has a really good phase 1, and his phase 2 is just him adding visual clutter to his already good phase 1. And while it certainly makes him worse, the essence of the first phase is still there, and once you learn all of his attacks and don't have to rely on visual cues, a lot of the issues with phase 2 become much less apparent, since what makes phase 2 bad isn't the attacks themselves, instead it's the very distracting visuals, which does make him feel like a completely terrible boss at the start, but once you have his attacks down, more of the actual good base movement starts to shine through and the boss becomes much more fun, bringing him overall to something like a 6 out of 10. And all you would really need to bring him back to like an 8 or 9 would be a patch that makes his phase 2 just more readable. Overall, while Radahn does have issues, I don't really think he's truly bad, but he also isn't exactly good, he's just kind of mid, but I still found him pretty fun. Although he is a disappointment when compared to the other DLC final bosses like Gale and Orphan, or bosses like Midra, Bale and Mesmer. But how would you guys rate him? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and like and subscribe for more of this stuff.